All right. So this moment in the conference is particularly special for me. So I have the honor of introducing my good friend John Quarles, who I was a graduate student with at the University of Florida under Benjamin Locke. Gosh, to have John speak here, it's really frustrating. Just he got to do this before me, but
Your fault,
I
man.
think John has really done amazing things. He's a career award winner, which is really a phenomenal thing. But he's also just a wonderful husband, and
Oh, you're a wonderful husband too, Kyle.
yeah, and to Kira and his kids, and it's really just amazing to see how far he's come, and the work that he's doing is just so important. So he's going to give us just I think, a beautiful talk today on such an important and timely topic. And so with that, just like to introduce John Quarles, and we'll cut to him in just a second.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Kyle. So what I'm going to talk about today is, let's start with this. Let's start with this. How many of your study participants look like this guy? I would bet a lot of your study participants look like this guy. So one thing that this guy, there's nothing wrong with this guy. He's probably a nice guy, right? The problem is that too many of our study participants look like this guy. Too many of our participants have this kind of a background that he has, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the thing to know about this guy is, yeah, he's probably a nice guy. He's probably a college student from a democratic society. He's relatively privileged. This guy really only represents like less than 5% of the world, and I think that is probably an overestimate. And I think that's a really big problem in our field and in a lot of fields. But I want to talk about it today specifically with respect to VR, and really, what does this mean if all of our participants look like this guy and have a background like this guy and think like this guy and act like this guy? What does that mean for the generalizability of our research? What does that mean for industry innovation? And really, what impact does that have on us in the future? And I think this is one of those things where people know about this, and they're like, "Yeah, it's a problem. What are we going to do about it?" The purpose of this talk really is to highlight that this is a bigger problem than you thought it was, and also give you some basic idea, like just some ideas that I've learned over time to start to prevent this, start to expand your participant populations and motivate people to do that, because it really is important. Because let's talk a little bit about what other fields have looked at have had this problem also. I think somewhere about 2010, I think there was another paper before this one. There was a movement within psychology, because classically in psychology, everybody uses intro to psych students, right? Because they're really easy to access. They're seemingly really diverse, right? They're seemingly really diverse. Because you get a lot in intro psych, you get a whole bunch of people. You get males, you get females. But the problem is that they're also all college students about the same age. They're all most of them, I'd say in psychology, at least in this paper, was talking about that most of them are from Western societies. they're well educated, they're from an industrialized nation, they're rich compared to the rest of the world, and they're from democratic societies, or this is the moniker weird. So that is, most psychology participants are weird. But it turns out that most people in the world are not weird. An example of this is if you take this classic perceptual illusion of two lines, right, where you put the little arrows on the end, this thing in the middle here. There's a lot of people that see this as, oh, the illusion is, well, one line, they're actually the same length, but the illusion is that one line is longer than the other. If you take people from with different backgrounds, like on the left of this figure here, they don't really see it an illusion at all. Whereas you take people on the right, it's a very strong illusion. So that should tell us, considering that VR is largely about perceptual illusion, I think this is going to have a pretty big impact on us, depending upon what people's backgrounds are and what kind of perception and how this affects their perception. So that's psychology, but let's get a little bit closer and let's talk about HCI in general. This was a paper last year at Chi that looked specifically at dimensions of diversity, and they looked specifically at 3 particular years from Chi, and they looked at they took this idea of weird and they expanded it, really putting more emphasis on the diversity research and the types of dimensions, the types of diversity. So beyond weird, there's age, there's mental ability, physical ability, sexual orientation, appearance, geographic location, all of these different kinds of things, which honestly most of the time people aren't thinking about in terms of diversity. And they, at least that was they wanted to see whether or not people were thinking about it, right? Were people studying this at all, or considering it in their research and considering how it impacted things? And they looked at 3 different years, and I think that at the time that there was a movement in Chi to make participant populations more diverse, and they wanted to see, well, was this movement really working? Were people really studying more? It looked like, if you look at the graph, there's kind of a trend, right? There's kind of a trend, an upward trend there, which is good, but you're still not getting people really considering all of these different dimensions, or they only consider a couple of them. And I think that the message of this paper is that we really need to consider more of these, because all this kind of the whole picture of your participants. And then let's go just recently. Katha Peck and her colleagues looked at gender equality in VR research. And I love this infographic because this is representative of like 10,000 subjects, participants that were in IEEE VR studies from 2015 to 2019. It's very clear here that there's gender inequality in the participants that we're using. It's very much, there's a lot more males than there are females. But the interesting thing about this paper was that, I mean, there's lots of interesting things about this paper, but one thing that I thought was really important about this was they asked, well, okay, there is gender inequality, but does it matter, right? Does it make a difference to our results? So they went back and reviewed simulator sickness and VR exposures, and they actually found that smaller increases in simulator sickness following VR exposure were observed in studies with a greater proportion of female participants, which, if you read the literature, is unusual. It's unexpected, actually. You'd expect it to go the other way. So I think that this is an example of when having inequality, having a lack of diversity in our research participants can actually lead us in the wrong direction. And so, but what other implications does this have? So the problem is that we're doing all of this. Most of the research is being done with like these weird users, right? That they're college students. Most of them are male, and I would bet a lot of them are gamers now. And this, this is what gets this particular population and their biases and interests start to influence our research. And then the results of our research influence product design and the kind of choices that are made there, and influence VR products which is driving the industry. And then those VR products, they're made for this weird guy, and this weird guy loves those VR products, right? But everybody else is kind of like, I can't use that. I'm going to get too sick, or it's too hard to use, or oh, that's really only for hardcore gamers. That's not going to be for me, and they're right, because it's not really designed for them. So I think this is a cycle. This is a cycle, and I think that we really have to start, as an academic community, we have to start thinking about how we can break this cycle. And so I want everybody to think about, well, what if all your participants did not look like that one dude, right? What if they looked more like people that are from different cultures, people that have different abilities, people that are from different locations? What effect would this have on academic research and industry innovation? Now, you're probably all wondering at this point, who is this Quarles dude and what does he know about diversity? Because I could have just as well put a picture of myself as that weird guy. Right? I think this is a very valid question. What do I know about diversity? Well, I have a little bit of perspective on it, just from my own perspective. I can't say I have the I will say I do come from a weird society. I do have a weird background, but there are certain things that in my life and in my research that have kind of brought this idea that diversity really is extremely important, and we really need to focus on it more than we have been. So I want to tell you a little bit about, just to give you my perspective. This is me in 2020. I'm an associate professor of computer science at the University of Texas, San Antonio. This is my incredibly messy research lab, and we even cleaned it up a little bit for the picture, I think. And but what I want to do is and I have multiple sclerosis, so this is the reason I'm in the wheelchair. I'm kind of in and out of the wheelchair. I'll tell you a little bit more about the specifics of that in a little bit. But I want. This is how I look. This is how I am now, right? This is me trying to use VR now, basically. So let's take a trip. Well, actually, before I go back in time, I'm going to go back in time. But before I go back in time, I want to kind of tell the story of how I got to this point and how I came to these conclusions about diversity. And but I don't want to just ignore everything else that happened that I'm not going to talk about. So I'm just going to briefly tell you what happened in my entire life the last 20 years. So basically, I got married, I had 2 kids, and I almost died a couple of times. And all of these things really shaped the way that I think about all of this stuff. And before all of that, it's not actually particularly interesting. Mostly I was drawing comic books, playing video games, and making music. So this is me in high school. Right on the tail end of high school, in the year 2000. And I was running cross country. I was playing in the coolest band in the school. And at some point, I played a lot of video games, right? I grew up playing video games. And I decided at some point, I want to make video games. So I'm going to get a computer science degree, because actually computer science is pretty fun and programming is fun. So I went to the University of Texas at Austin and got a degree there. Somewhere along near to the end of my my undergraduate, I decided I want to go to graduate school and become a professor. And I was kind of deciding what is it that I want to do. I was pretty sure at that point I wanted to do virtual reality stuff. I had a little bit of experience with it in undergrad, but not a lot. And I went to interview at Ben Locke's lab in Gainesville, Florida, and they had this pit demo running. And this was a virtual, I believe I first saw this on a virtual reality V8 headset, this big clunky thing that all you youngsters don't appreciate now. But I saw this pit demo, and I put the headset on, and I was looking over the pit, and I remember Ben was like, look, he thinks he's gonna fall into the pit. He's kind of imbalanced and is about to fall into the pit. And I was like, whoa, this is what I want to do. This is so much fun. Something that I can do something that I can work on that has this effect on people is super amazing. So I think that honestly, I think everybody in VR who's getting into VR should try a pit experiment, because it is still one of the strongest perceptual illusions. The strongest sense, it elicits the strongest sense of presence of a lot of things that I've seen. It's really simple to do, but it's a lot of fun. So I decided to go and be a graduate student and get my PhD with Ben Locke as my advisor. And now in 2004, around the time that I started my graduate studies, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And this originally came about from, I had some other symptoms before that. But one day I woke up and one of my eyes was like kind of cloudy. It was weird because it was like just one of my eyes. And my wife was like, don't mess around with your eyes, go get that checked out. And so I went, and they did an MRI, and sure enough, I had something called optic neuritis. And my sister also had multiple sclerosis, so that helped me get diagnosed probably earlier than I normally would have. And but I had optic neuritis, and I ended up having optic neuritis in the other eye later, and some other issues along the way. But it didn't really impede me that much in my studies. So I spent the next 5 years playing around with anesthesia machines and mixed reality. That was a lot of fun. This is what I was doing my PhD on. And then in 2009, I met Trent Reznor through the efforts of my wife. I got a job at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and I proceeded to shortly thereafter have a massive MS attack. And this is really what started, me thinking about, well, I didn't realize that, this is going to have an effect on my VR. I didn't think about it before, right? So before the MS attack, I was, perfectly fine in VR, walking around, swinging things around, bumping my controllers into the wall. Well, okay, I don't think I bumped my controller. We didn't have a Vive back then. The controllers didn't quite look like that. But so I was able to use VR just fine before the MS attack. After the MS attack, now given I could still walk. It was with a cane, like without VR. I could still walk. I had a cane. Sometimes I'd be in sometimes I have like a walker or a wheelchair, but mostly I was walking around with a cane. So it did impact my walking. I think it probably impacted my fatigue, as getting fatigued more quickly after walking for a while. So I wasn't expecting that to have basically I couldn't use VR walking around anymore. As soon as I put the head mount on and try to stand up, I would pretty much fall over. An example of this is one time I was visiting Evan Rosenberg's lab in USC, and they had a redirected walking experiment running, and they had put gravel down to make it more, immersive. And I put this Wi-Fi head mount on. It must be like I forget how much it cost, but it's like a $50,000 head mount. And everybody was like, "Are you sure you're gonna be okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'll be fine. Don't worry about it." And then I took one step, and I wiped out right on my ass. And then what I was worried about was, did I just break this really expensive HMD? But everybody there was like, "Oh, are you okay?" They were really nice and helped me up and stuff like that. And this is an example of basically VR is inaccessible. And if it's inaccessible to me, it must be inaccessible to a lot of people. And so this kind of started the idea of, well, why is VR inaccessible? Why is this happening? I had a lot of problems that I didn't have before. Like I had some color perception problems. I'm not like legally, I'm not actually red green blind or anything, but I have slightly one of my eyes has slightly less red perception, like be able to differentiate between two different reds. I had numbness in my hands and feet. I had balance deficits. I had muscle fatigue and weakness and decreased proprioception. And I started wondering, well, how does this affect my experience in VR? Does it decrease my presence? I kind of expected that it would. What effect does latency have? What effect does cyber sickness have when I have all these issues? And I was looking in the literature, and there wasn't a whole lot of support. So my my students and I at the San Antonio Virtual Environments Lab, we decided that we should really be studying this. That's one of the first things that we started to look at was presence. And actually, this was largely Ron Kaigo's work, who's now at Kennesaw State University, and this was kind of influenced by some of my previous experiences because we decided to do a pit experiment. And really what we wanted to find out is what is the difference between people that have disabilities like that you experience in MS and all the people that we studied for the past 20 or 30 years that didn't. What can we expect? Again, the whole point of this is, well, we want to figure out why is it inaccessible, why is VR inaccessible, and what can we do to make it more accessible? So we decided to run a pit study, replicate the classic pit study, very similar to the one that I had tried at Ben Locke's lab several years before. And we were comparing presence people with MS to people without MS, and using a standard presence questionnaire. So what we found, this is just a snapshot of what we found, really, was that it wasn't really what we thought was going to happen. I think that the original hypothesis was that, well, all of these issues that people with MS have, all of these symptoms that they have, are going to negatively affect their presence all the time. So obviously they're probably going to have lower presence. It wasn't that simple. It turned out that in some cases, like actually being able to manipulate, the things in the environment were not as easy. Whereas the naturalness of the mechanism of the movement, that is, in this case, walking around, was actually judged as being more natural than people who didn't have MS. And this was really puzzling. So it seemed like, well, actually, there's, in some sense, these MS participants are actually having a higher sense of, a stronger sense of presence. And we thought that was unusual. So we decided to study this a little bit further and look at, well, maybe this is because in this previous experiment we didn't have an avatar, and maybe the lack of an avatar is, that's another difference between the real world and the virtual world, is that in the real world I can see my body, right? So maybe having an avatar will improve my ability to be able to walk in VR. It didn't really, but it did have some interesting effects on presence that we weren't really expecting. Because part of the problem is when you start trying to run experiments with populations that haven't really been tested very much before, your hypotheses, a lot of times there's not a lot of literature support, and it becomes more exploratory, and your hypotheses end up being wrong. So you kind of have to expect the unexpected with stuff like this. So we wanted to look to see, well, what happens if we introduce an avatar? What does this do to people's presence? And it wasn't what we expected, again. So basically, if the people who had a mobility impaired avatar, that is the people that were mobility impaired and could, when they saw their avatar, they had a higher sense of presence. And then you have, when they had no avatar, it was lower. But the interesting thing here is that having an avatar in this case actually made the healthy people without MS or any mobility impairments, it made them have lower presence, which was really weird. And again, this is kind of similar to the last result that we saw, and we still weren't really sure. Okay, so it's not avatars. Avatars do seem to have an effect, though. So maybe we should look at latency, because latency, maybe these two populations have a difference in the experience of latency. So we decided to look at latency, and this was largely the work of Gayani Samarawira, who is now at Amazon, numerous years ago, and she really looked a lot at latency and what effect this has on people with mobility impairments. So we wanted to look to see, well, what if we introduce latency? We want to see what the effect of latency was. So we took several different amounts of sort of artificially inserted latency, and we wanted to see, well, how does also this really affect how people walk, how people move through the environment? How does it affect your walking pattern? So we had this this walking mat called a gait ride. It measures all the different things about your walking patterns. So like how fast you're walking, how far apart your feet are when you hit the ground on average, how long you spend standing on both feet, for example. There's a whole bunch of parameters. Look at a lot of them. Here's an example of just velocity, just how quickly people were moving. So latency did seem to affect people in the way that you would think it would. Obviously, more latency seemed to, in some cases, slow people down, and in some cases not. But the most interesting thing here was kind of the opposite effect that avatars had on people's performance. So for the people with mobility impairments, avatars actually slowed them down, whereas for the people without mobility impairments, avatars actually sped them up, which was weird. Again, a difference that we really weren't expecting. And I will say this, I'm highlighting the differences here. We found a lot of things that were the same. So I'd say by and large, a lot of things that happen, the differences that you see in the real world between these two populations generally persist in the virtual world. But sometimes those things in the virtual world will introduce new differences as well, this is an example of that. So we thought, that's interesting. So maybe this has something to do with the participants' perception of latency. So maybe they're not noticing that the latency, maybe that's what's affecting people's presence. Maybe that's why they're slowing down. They don't actually notice that they're spending more time looking at themselves or looking at the environment or something like that. And maybe they're just not maybe it's just not as noticeable to them. Maybe these things that break other people's presence are not as noticeable to people with mobility impairments. So we decided to replicate another study which looked at kind of the perception of just noticeable differences. This is really a psychophysical study. And this was a study where it was really just like you look left and right in VR, and you look up and down at a very standard cadence, and so we had people do this and then judge, was there more latency or less latency, and can you tell the difference between them, kind of thing. And of course, what we found again was users with MS notice latency less. That is, their just noticeable difference was at sort of a greater threshold than people without MS. And so we thought, that's interesting. So that could be part of it, right? But one of the things I can tell you from doing all this for so long, I did try this one when we were piloting it, and that makes me dizzy just doing it in the real world, and it makes me sick in the virtual world. So we thought we really need to look at cyber sickness also, because I think a lot of people got cyber sick after this study, and a lot of people got, I mean, not like significantly so, but enough to where you could tell. And the previous latency study, there were some cyber sickness differences that we saw between the two populations also. So we wanted to look at, well, maybe there's differences in cyber sickness also. And this was largely the work of Imtiaz Arafat, who is currently a lecturer at UTSA right now. And so what we decided to do was put people in a virtual riding simulation. So this is not a virtual driving simulation, it's a virtual riding simulation, because we really did want to elicit cyber sickness symptoms. I have a tarp in my lab now. Okay, precisely, just in case. Luckily, we've never had anybody throw up. This is all IRB approved. Everybody knew basically what the potential risks were before they got into it. But basically, we had people drive around this windy mountain path, or ride around this windy mountain path for like 10 minutes, and we gave them a mess of physiological and EEG measures, and we also looked at their cyber sickness through the simulator sickness questionnaire. And there's a lot of results here. I'd say a lot. One of the, again, this is like an example of where you see things that exist in the real world persist. The differences that exist in the real world persist in the virtual world. So you can see here in the GSR, people, even though the people with MS started out with a lower GSR, so they were sweating less, for example, that this tended to persist throughout the experience, and there was a correlation between these kinds of things. But there were also differences that we really weren't expecting. So, for example, in the brain signals, now I'm not going to go into all the details of how this was all processed. You can go back and read the paper from a couple of years ago. I think this was in 2018. You can go look at VR 2018. This is where MTS's paper was published. In some parts of the brain, it was pretty similar. In other parts of the brain, like this, in the T3 location, they had a fairly similar. Both groups had a fairly similar reaction, whereas in the F3 location, it was completely opposite. There was almost an inverse correlation there, which was and a significant difference. So we were puzzled by this, but we're basically, what this is saying is that, well, what this could be saying is that the experience of cyber sickness is different and between these two populations. And so this got us thinking about, well, maybe cyber sickness reduction is not going to be as effective. Maybe there's going to be a difference there. And we haven't published this yet, but preview, there is a difference. But stay tuned for whenever we publish this, and then you can see what that is. We also did some work with 3D interaction in terms of. We also tried to branch out outside of people with MS and look at kids with autism spectrum disorder. And this was largely the work of Chow Mei, who's also at Kennesaw State University. And we were wondering, well, how usable are 3D interfaces for children with ASD? I mean, it could be that these could be very useful interfaces for them. It is known that there are issues with being able to predict movement of objects, being able to hand-eye coordination. So we thought, well, maybe this could eventually be worked into treatment. But there was really not a whole lot of literature on how usable what impact does a 3D interface have on kids with autism. And we compared typically developed kids with autism, and of course we found that there was a difference. Children with ASD perform the task slower and with more interactions. So it turns out that 3D user interfaces are not quite as usable, even for kids with autism. This is high functioning autism that we tried this with. One thing I can tell you that I think shaped some of our work later on, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but they loved this. The kids with autism were so into this, and they didn't want to stop doing it. We had a couple of other experiences that we tried them with, like they made food and stuff like that, and they were really into it. So we thought, maybe we could, really get kids with autism, or just kids, interested in, with other disabilities, interested in, and we can impact them. So I spent a lot of time wondering why VR is inaccessible. My research group spent a lot of time trying to figure out what are the different aspects of VR which make it less accessible. We found a lot of differences between populations and a lot of unusual effects that we weren't expecting, right? But there's still a question as to why and especially now that we have VR products out there, a lot of VR products out there, why are VR products inaccessible? Is that actually there's a lot of easy things that you can do, and I'll talk about this a little bit, but there's a lot of simple things that you can do to make VR products more accessible. And why are we not doing that? This from an industry perspective, let's look at the numbers. So there's 7.7 million people in the world in 2019. 1.15 and 1.15 billion. What did I say? 7.7 billion people in the world in 2019. And 1.15 billion people had a disability in 2018. So that's 15% of the people. In 2014, there was a forecast for VR that said there's going to be 171 million people using VR by 2018, which is about 2% of the world. I don't think we quite made that. I couldn't find numbers on what today is. So I think this is a gross overestimation. But at the same time, it's still like, look at all these other people that we could include if we could. This other 15% of people, right? So there's a lot of people that aren't using VR that could, and I think that accessibility is definitely a barrier. And the thing about accessibility is if you address that barrier with people that have real accessibility problems, then a lot of times it makes it better for everybody else too. So we really need to be doing this. And so we wanted to think about why is the industry not really addressing this very well? So we didn't have any hypotheses about this. We just decided to go and talk to people. One of my students was very interested in doing this, and he came into my office. Didn't know this guy. He came into my office and said, "I want to make VR more accessible because I want to play VR games." This is a guy he has muscular dystrophy, and I said, "I want to do the same thing. Let's do this." And so we decided, let's just go interview a bunch of people and figure out why it is that what do they do to help make VR more accessible. So he went around and interviewed 13 VR developers from companies with ranging from numbers of just one, so a solo VR developer, to 100K people, just so that we could get a wider perspective of it. And largely what we were trying to figure out was, what do you do in your development routines to make VR more accessible? Okay. And to tell you the answer to this, I'm going to tell you a really just poorly written joke. Okay. How many VR developers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Hint. The light bulb is VR accessibility. Okay. How many VR developers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, they didn't know it was unscrewed, right? And of course, one of the reasons this could be because, well, they all have head mounts on and they couldn't tell the light was off. Okay, but really, they didn't know. Okay, they didn't know that this was an issue. So it's just a lack of awareness. That's largely why I think it's not just cost. It's not just cost. I think that companies will support this, support accessibility if they really realize it's a problem and they really realize that there is a demand for it. So the result of this was we really need to raise awareness about an accessibility of VR. That there's a lot of people that would like to use VR but really can't. So here's some ideas that we had and a lot of these we're trying to work on. For example, you can plan accessible VR game jams or hackathons. This is something that we're actually at UTSA, we're going to start trying to do. Probably initially virtually or online because we can't bring people out right now. And I think it would be good it would make it easier for people to I think we should solve that problem also in terms of having people collaborate across in different geographic locations. I think the key to this is, though, you have to integrate participatory design. You can't just say, make an accessible game. Here's an example of somebody with a disability, try to make an accessible game for them. You have to integrate that person onto the team. So the accessible VR game jam, you'd have an artist, you'd have developers, you'd have sound designer people, and you'd also have somebody with a particular disability or a set of disabilities that could help inform that and be on they would be on the design team. Right. Generally, we need to use, promote more open source accessibility tools for VR. There's not a whole lot of those out there. We should integrate accessibility into VR curricula, which I don't think there's a whole lot of that out there either. From a company perspective, publicize your VR apps accessibility features. I think it's a good publicity. It will get more people interested in your product. More people will buy it. and talk to other developers about accessibility challenges, especially since there's, we already know that there's a lot of times there's just a lack of awareness about it. I went to a symposium about a year ago at Cornell Tech called XR Access, where they brought together industry, academia, influencers, content creators, and just people, general enthusiasts of VR, to talk about how do we make VR more accessible, what are the main problems, what are the things that we can do. It was like a couple of days workshop, and it was a really good experience. And I think we left with a plan for some things that we can do. I would suggest checking this out and getting involved if you can. I thought it was a really good experience. So get involved. That's one thing. Develop more accessibility tools. There is this one thing called Walk-in VR Driver, which this is just a couple of examples of what it can do. And they basically use simple ways of making VR games more accessible for people with in wheelchairs, people that have missing a limb, and to make it make it accessible for them to play these games at all. This is a free tool that you can get. I don't believe it is. It's not open source from what I can tell, and unfortunately, I don't know whether it's actually in development anymore because they haven't updated the page in a while. It's entirely implemented in Steam VR, so it pretty much works with any Steam VR game, which is, I think, a good way of doing it to make it more inclusive of all the games that can take advantage of it. But I think we need more tools than this. This really just scratches the surface. I think this helps a lot of people, but it's still not enough. We still need more tools like this. Okay, so we've talked about VR. I've been talking about accessibility for a long time. I am trying to promote accessibility of VR and that it's a problem. But I think the grander thing that I want, the bigger problem in our field that this fits into is diversity. Because people with different backgrounds, as I've talked about in some of the previous literature, people with different backgrounds are gonna, just like all these people with disabilities, are gonna have a different experience. Our previous research results may not hold true with different populations. What we think is going to happen based upon the literature may not be what actually happens when these people put a VR headset on. So if we want to survive as a community, that if we want our research to really influence VR products in the future and make them available and broaden that user base, I think we need to think about how can we make our research use more diverse participants. And I'm just going to give you a few easy ways to do that. So number 5, replicate previous experiments, but recruit underrepresented, untested populations. I've done this a number of times. In most cases, many cases, you will find surprising results and make a good contribution. It won't just be like, oh, it's somebody replicated something. It's really more like somebody replicated something, and oh, look, this result persists and it's generalized to these other populations. I think that is a novel contribution in itself, and people should try to do this, especially if you have access to a population that hasn't been tested before, or that just relatively minimally tested. Collaborate with more researchers from diverse geographic locations, and I think, and because basically different geographic locations are going to give you access to different people with different backgrounds, that we really need to generalize our results. I think that this also means that we should be sharing data, processing data from different populations, pooling data. I think this is really important now, especially since we're moving a lot of things online. When reviewing papers, place more weight on population diversity. So everybody, I think that the reviewers already do this to some degree, right? But most papers, I mean, judging from Tabitha Peck's paper, right? A lot of papers don't even report gender. And most of them don't report any diversity dimensions beyond gender. I think that we should be putting more weight on having population diversity in our judging contributions. So I know everybody. I think people are aware of this, but I think we should just put more weight on it than we already do. Maybe there should be a separate little section in there that says, do they have a general? Do they have a random population, or are they? Do they have a diverse population that they, or a population that hasn't been looked at as much? Actively recruit participants from pools outside your university. It's so easy to recruit your students to do things. I'm guilty of doing that too. I mean, I've had other research that I've done outside of doing all the work with people with disabilities, and yeah, it's really easy to recruit participants from your university. But I think we need to think about moving away from only doing that. I don't mean stop doing it completely, but recruit other people, different ages, from the general community with different socioeconomic backgrounds than just university students. Just because they're easy to get doesn't mean that we should always use them. And this is one thing I think that's really easy to do, and that really everybody should start doing it, is collect more data from your participants and report it about their diverse backgrounds. And we already talked about how there's a whole bunch of diversity dimensions that most research doesn't even collect. We ought to have just standard questionnaires that everybody can use that collect all this information from people, so that we can identify the gaps. Where are the gaps in the backgrounds of participants that we haven't studied yet? Where do we need more to recruit more participants from? And if it doesn't fit into the paper, then that's fine. You can put it into the supplement of the paper, which I think we should all really be doing this now, collecting more data from your participants about their backgrounds and reporting it. And lastly, I just wanted to, this is something I'm doing currently. My student Rafael Costa is working on this, where we are trying to put VR in aquatic therapy pools for kids with cerebral palsy and other types of disabilities who are going through therapy. And I will say this picture is representative, like the proudest moment in my career. Just seeing the joy on this girl's face, who probably didn't have access to VR at all, really. So this was really, she hadn't had a whole lot of experience with it even before. So by doing these kinds of things, by doing this kind of research where we try to include different populations, it really does make a difference. It really does have an effect on people's lives, and it is incredibly rewarding. So I'd like to thank all of my students that I've worked with on all this stuff, because none of this would have happened. And I'd especially like to thank the organizers for, this is a huge honor for me to do this, to give this talk. And last thing I want to say is we're hiring at UTSA. We're doing a cluster hire in VR and AR. We'll probably be doing it next year also. So please apply. I'm talking directly to those soon to be graduating PhD students. Okay, apply, talk to me, and I hope to see you at UTSA soon. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And we'll expect your check in the mail for that free advertising. All right. Well, why don't we cut over quickly to my slide, Anton? Okay, so sorry for that little snafu. So John, we actually have lots of questions over on the Slido. I don't know if you were aware, but people were asking questions the whole time that you were talking. And just so everyone out there is aware, you can type your questions and you can upvote other people's questions. And so I'm just going to kind of start at the top.
Okay.
That was a really awesome talk, and thank you for not messing that up. I appreciate it. You did a really wonderful job.
Thanks.
And so I think a lot of these questions actually have to deal with just recruitment. So the number one question on here is, do you think that increasing diversity, and this is by Alejandro, will imply that we need to increase the sample size to obtain significant results for our studies? So I think this is really about, do we need to make our participant pools just larger, or is there some other way?
I don't think it necessarily. I mean, honestly, we should all be making our participant pools larger, anyways, because interestingly enough, using t-tests and stuff like that. I mean, the statisticians can. I'm not really a statistician, but they can weigh in on this. T-tests are not really meant for like 30 people.
Right.
Yeah, we all kind of accept that that's the tool that we have, right? But outside of that, I don't think we need to do large. I don't think that it doesn't have to be more people. It just has to be more diverse people. I mean, a lot of these statistical tests they're set up to where you're supposed to have as random of a population as you can, really, which is kind of impossible to do in one study. But having a more random sample is, I think, generally better. I would say worry more about. I would say generally, if you've got a more diverse population, you can trust your results more than if you have the same number of people. If you have a whole mess of people, but they're all the same weird person. That's my opinion.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna kind of go to the next one. João Paulo Lima from Brazil. I love how many international participants we have. Do you believe that the lack of diversity in VR study participants is related to the lack of diversity in the VR research community members?
Yes.
All right.
I mean,
I'll go on.
It very well could be, right? So a lot of times, especially if people are not exposed to VR, if they don't know how awesome and fun it is, then they're not going to know that, like, oh, this is something that I can go and do. Like I can say and a lot of times people just don't think about, if they're not exposed to it, then they're not going to think that they can do it, right? Or that they can think they could have an impact on it or become interested in it. So I think that does. I think that in order to get more faculty, more researchers in this area that are more diverse, also, because that is also a problem. I didn't talk about that really, but that is a huge problem as well. My opinion is we got to start at the bottom. We got to start young. Get people involved young. Get more kids involved from different backgrounds. And I think that it's not an overnight solution, but it is something that we need to do because there's a lot of that is a major problem as well.
Right. So let's see. So is anonymous. So people can post anonymously as well. It says, we did try to work with people with disabilities, but the supporting organizations were rather suspicious that we might make disabled people uncomfortable or to do something wrong. And what's your advice in such cases?
I will say, especially a lot of these questions are about recruitment. Recruitment and working with people with disabilities is not easy because there's not as many of them, and they're not as easy to get to come out to places sometimes based upon depending upon what their disability is. Sometimes organizations are concerned about this. I've had the same experience. I think most of the participants that we've recruited for most of our studies, we've gone out to support groups and recruited them individually, or we've gone to, like, I usually frequent the MS walk, for example, and hide behind the little booth where they give at the MS walk, they give t-shirts to everybody with MS for free. So I hide behind that little booth. It's like my own way of profiling the people with the disease. And then I'll approach them and say, hey, are you interested in doing a study or whatever? And a lot of them are really open to it, actually. It's really that is really more an organizational fear, and it also depends on the organization. I'd say you do find that. For example, though, not all organizations are that way. So, especially if you're trying to work with like a rehabilitation place, um, sometimes they will also be concerned about how can we do this during billable hours, because your research doesn't really fit in with being, billing our. We have to pay our therapists, and they're only working during billable hours. How do we fit research in between in that? This in doing this aquatic therapy stuff, I've been working with the Children's Rehabilitation Institute in San Antonio, and they're actually there's one of those in the U.S. They're all over Mexico. They have like 20,000 kids, and it's entirely nonprofit. And so I had never heard them say billable hours to me. They're always like, "Yeah, just come out and try it out. Like, we're just doing a therapy session with like 5 kids today. You can come and try it out." And we were like, "Really? Okay, well, I mean, work with your IRB. Obviously, don't do things that are unethical." But because everybody still has to sign consent forms and like things like that. But I think in terms of recruiting, the bottom line is going to it would be really nice. And other people have had there are situations where people have had success with this, but I have never had really great success in getting organizations involved. But getting individuals involved it's still a lot of work. It's still a lot of hours that we put into doing recruitment for these specific populations. But I think it's worth it.
Awesome. I'm going to sort of stay on the topic, unfortunately, of recruitment, because that seems to be what everybody is interested in. So the number one question we still have up there is how can we increase the diversity? But I think what this is getting at is if you just put a call out for participants, you're going to get all white males, or at least a high percentage. And so how do you sort of do we? I think it's do we still do that sort of thing, or we throw that model out the window?
I don't think we necessarily have to throw it out the window. I think we just have to make an effort to look beyond that. Don't rely on that population. Honestly, I think recruiting people with disabilities is probably harder than. It's not so hard to create. It's just that finding them and connecting with them is a little bit more difficult than connecting with the general population. But I think, I think you really just have to make an effort. I mean, spend a little bit of extra time on recruitment. Don't assume that like, oh, we're just going to use a participant pool and it's free. Like we get like it's free to our time, right? Spend a little bit of extra time recruiting people from different places, and you'll get different, with different mechanisms, and you'll get different people involved. There's only so much control you have, but this is another reason why I suggest collaborate with people from other places. You can almost ensure that you will have different people simply with different backgrounds from different places. If you're not just limiting yourself to your own geographic location.
Yeah. All right. And so thank you. And just going to ask one last question because you already touched on this, but Sarah Lehman from Temple, who I'm assuming she's a student, soon to be graduating PhD, looking to start their own research, and just wants to know what advice you would give her to start her own research effort in this area.
Find good collaborators. I didn't do that until later, probably. You only have 24 hours in the day, so you can't do everything yourself, even though everyone's like, oh, you have to be the leader of everything, and you have to be the single PI on everything, and blah, 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 and all of that stuff, which, is largely still true in terms of the way that people are judging tenure. But I think that you should figure out what populations that you can get access to wherever you're going to be. Find other researchers who are interested that you could team up with to find those populations. Because I will say, like, a lot of the things that I do in my research, it's not like we have a huge technical barrier. It's a bigger barrier to us is finding the people to do it a lot of the time. So expect that you're going to spend time doing that. train your students so that they can do this too. Honestly, making connections with participants is what's going to get them to keep coming, to tell their friends, keep the flow coming in. And just figure out what resources that you can use. I'd say first, I'm telling everybody to go spread out geographically, but also when you're first starting out, it's easier to collaborate with people who are in the same place as you or in the same city as you, because you can go and hold them accountable and sit across from them and be like, why aren't you helping me? So yeah, I think find good collaborators, do a little bit of homework as to how you're going to recruit your people, because different places have different access to different people, and help that drive your research. And honestly, just talk to the people with disabilities and figure out what their problems are. Get to know them better, and I think it will drive your research forward.
Awesome way to end the talk. Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate it, and hope you hang out in hubs for a little bit during the break and let people meet up with you. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
And if you'll stop sharing your screen real quick, I will share mine, and I can actually just do that and force that. And so just thank you again briefly. So we're going into break, and I just want to remind everybody to please be social in VR. There's actually around 1,800 of you out there. Just got to go and find them. That's the hard part about the internet, is you just can't see them. And so you've got to use your tools, use Slack, use Twitch chat, or just go to IEEE VR online. Go into one of the hubs room if you're registered. Go to the website and just try to find different places where people might be. And so there's lots of stuff coming up today. Of course, we've got our break. We've got a paper session, our first paper session coming up at 11. And then after that, one of the coolest things of the online experience, I think, is going to be the ability to just explore poster rooms and video rooms together. And so we've got a chain of, Blair probably knows the exact number, but 40 or so different poster rooms that you can go explore and just and see these posters and talk to the authors. And so that'll be after that first break, that first session. Then we have a lunch, and so everybody go eat. But of course, be social during that time as well. Find some other people maybe to eat with, chat on Zoom, or go into hubs or whatever you want to do. And then we'll have a couple more sessions and our first panel in the afternoon, and then our 3D UI contest and research demos. Our phase one version of that in the evening. And so I hope you all really enjoy this experience today. Participate, again, be social, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, Kyle.
Yes, Blair.
One more thing. Please check out the Birds of a Feather page on the main IEEE VR org 2020 website. There's already about a dozen Birds of a Feathers listed during all during breaks and lunches in the evening. So be sure to go check out some of them in case there's something you'd like to see, and or submit one. Anyway, we'll see you online.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.